I've been in Italy for 8 years, and in that time I've lived in 5 different rental properties. And when I reflect on each of those experiences, there are definitely things that I would do differently today if I was starting to rent for the very first time. I would initially begin by really considering what it means to live in a residence or a condominium. Now, this tends to be like the predominant form of housing here in Italy. Of course, you can have your independent homes, your villas, absolutely, but you will find absolutely everywhere apartment style blocks. And sometimes these are part of a gated community, and sometimes they are just on the street. Now, 4 out of the 5 homes that I've lived in to date have been that style of living. But what I didn't do was really reflect on what living in that kind of environment is actually like. The first thing is the condominium fees. Now, I didn't understand these at all when I first moved to Italy, and I have to be honest with you, as time has gone on, I've gradually fallen out of love with them. These are fees that you have to pay in addition to your rent every single month when you live in this type of building if you have shared spaces like communal stairways or lifts, for example. Now, the amount you pay really does vary, and it depends on your building, and it depends on if you have any kind of shared gardens or a caretaker. When we lived in Salerno in this type of residence, we paid around €50 every month, I think. But the buildings we were in at that time didn't have a caretaker. We were only paying for the cleaning of the stairs and the lift and the maintenance of them. Now, Palermo was the one that really made me fall out of love with the condominium fees, because that was the first time I'd actually lived in a really big gated residence. There was a caretaker, shared gardens. It was big. There were lots of people living in this residence, lots of individual buildings within the same space. Now, the problem with that was that it meant the condominium fees fluctuated from one month to the next. So sometimes they'd be as low as €50, but I think I can probably count on one hand in 2.5 years how often that actually was. And then other times they'd be closer to €100 and sometimes even above that. And the reason it fluctuated so much was because, number one, each and every resident contributed towards the caretaker's salary. Now, I do think it's actually a huge plus to have a caretaker as part of your residence if you have this option, because if you're not at home to collect parcels, extra security, like there are so many good reasons as to why this is, but of course you are also contributing to their salary. And it also means that, twice a year, there's going to be extra money that you contribute as they take extra money at that time in the summer and at Christmas. Now, not only that, but of course, if you have shared gardens, this is wonderful, but I will say, from my experience in Palermo, there tend to be lots of rules and regulations as to how those shared spaces can be used. So we had like a massive garden area that was fenced off, gated off and padlocked. And you could ask for a key to that space, but if you ever tried to use it, you would be like subject to a whole list of regulations. We were not able to walk Tina in those grounds, even if she was on a leash. You weren't able to have food or drink in the grounds. You couldn't have like a picnic, for example. And so in the end, this space just remained kind of empty 90% of the time, unless like some kids went in and played football occasionally from time to time. So it's a shame. You don't have as much freedom necessarily over shared spaces depending on the setup of your residence. But what it means if you have these gardens is that this adds to the cost of your condominium. So we were forever having to pay for like maintenance of the grounds when they used to spray the trees for the mosquitoes. And of course, if you've got like a larger area to cover, this is going to impact the amount you pay. Now, what I will say, something that I could never wrap my head around when it came to condominium fees was the way that they divided the electricity for the lift. So each block within this residence had a certain number of floors to it, and we lived on the top floor of this particular block. And the way that they would divide the electricity for the lift was that, depending on the floor level you were on, was dependent on how much you would contribute to this electricity. So because we were at the top, we were paying the most in our block towards the cost of the electricity. I couldn't wrap my head around this because although logically this makes sense, the lift has to travel further to reach us, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm using the lift all the time. Like if I use the lift twice a day and everybody else on the lower levels used it 5, 6, 7 times as they're going about their everyday life, I'm not really sure how that adds up. But nevertheless, this was the situation. And then, of course, they were constantly doing work. So the cleaning of the grounds and the cleaning of the shared spaces was every single week. But then on top of that, they would decide to do like maintenance of certain aspects of the building. They would be cleaning the garden, doing the mosquito spraying that I spoke about before. And so it felt like every single month there was something being done in the residence, and it always felt like our condominium bill was expensive. And I think as a tenant, you feel like you don't have a lot of control over this. They do have regular meetings for the condominium, but usually it's the owners of the properties that attend those meetings. It's kind of rare to have the tenants go to those. But it's this. I think the condominium is something that you must really consider the condominium bill because, as I said, it's in addition to your rent. There is a little bit of respite though, because if there is any major work that needs to be done within the residence, so for example, in our residence back in Palermo, just before we left, they were talking about restructuring the entire car park, and that was going to be quite a big job. But tenants wouldn't be responsible for that because it's considered more structural. It's not your everyday, day-to-day maintenance. And so this is something that, you can have a bit of an outer with, but everything else you are responsible for paying towards. And I just think it's hard to budget sometimes when you have a residence that size and the bills are not constant. So that was why I fell out of love with the condominium bill for sure. Something else you've got to think about with this type of living though is your neighbours. What are your neighbours like? I've had pretty good experiences with my neighbours to date. But I think Palermo was the place where, because there were so many people living within this residence, I perhaps had some different experiences because there was a family that moved in just before we left actually, and they perhaps didn't respect the residents in the same way that other people did. And on New Year's Eve, they decided to have their own firework display in the middle of the car park where everyone's cars were parked. And the fireworks were like flying everywhere past our balcony. Tina was going nuts, as I'm sure you can imagine. And it was crazy. Like, there was uproar in the condominium afterwards, of course, and people were saying they were going to call the police if it ever happened again. But this is what you have to consider with this style of living. It's not so much the way that you look after your place, but it's how everybody else respects it as well. And I think, this is why, and I don't want to kind of discredit the companies that offer this service because I think it's a really, really good one. But this is why I always say that you should come and visit properties in person. Now, I know that there are some organisations that offer this service for people who aren't able to, and they will do like live video calls. They will walk you through the property. They will answer questions. They will manage everything on your behalf. Now, I know some of my members in my community have used these types of services and they've been really happy, and that's great. But I think for me as a person and the experiences I've had living here, it's not something that I would ever feel comfortable with doing, because I think what you've got to consider is that sometimes you pick up on things intuitively, energetically, and somebody who's viewing a property on your behalf may not be concerned with like neighbours or the energy of the place or what the shared spaces look like. And that's something that you can pay attention to if you are looking at the place yourself. It's a huge deal. Okay, you've also got to consider noise, like how noisy are your neighbours? A lot of this will depend on the floor level that you decide to choose to kind of live on. I mean, I have lived on the lower levels of apartments. That second floor was the lowest I ever lived on, and sixth floor was the highest. And I can tell you that the higher you are, the quieter it gets, but there are some disadvantages with that, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But the lower you are, the noisier it can become. If you're on the street, for example, you've got traffic noise, but if you're in an apartment, then you've got people above you and below you, and that can be a bit noisy because, disclaimer, Italians are loud, and so you tend to hear everything in these kinds of buildings because the soundproofing is not great. So I've had experiences of hearing people like running around with heels on in their apartment, kids running around screaming, it feeling like you're, I don't know, in a bit of an earthquake situation because kids are like jumping on the floor. So it's something. And this is why you absolutely need to come and view the homes yourself, I think. And you need to try and come, I would say, later in the day as possible, because then you have an idea of who's at home and what the noise is like. Because if you come in the middle of the day, maybe people are at work, kids are at school, you don't really get a feel for how loud it can be. But if you can come later in the day, and it's quite a good tip, I think, and it's something I've never done and I wish I had, I think you get a better idea for the sound and the average kind of noise that you can expect. Now, the reason I was saying that it can be not so great to live on the top floor is I tie it back to Palermo, but it can get really, really hot. Now, this depends on how old your building is. It depends on how well insulated it is. So where we lived in Palermo, it was not very well insulated at all. And some of the homeowners had even taken steps to try to further insulate the apartments to try to make them cooler in the summer, but it was still a problem. And so our summers there were crazy. We were so hot. We only had one air conditioning unit in the kitchen, but that was it. And yes, we could have got more air conditioning units. Absolutely. We could have taken steps to remedy that. But it's just to tell you that if you're on the top floor of an apartment like this is what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to take extra steps to keep that place as cool as possible, because essentially the sun is going to be beating down on the roof every single day. And it can also work the reverse way as well. In the winter, the heat can escape a lot quicker from the top floor apartment. So you're going to have to make sure that it's well insulated in some way to preserve the heat inside. So yeah, there's a lot with residents living, I would say, and it kind of goes beyond just the location. You've really, really got to consider these things. And I would say with some of our experiences, I found it difficult living in this kind of place, because you're having to deal with other people and sometimes other people can be quite selfish. Like, I'll give you another example. The day that we moved out of our place in Palermo, we had a group WhatsApp for the condominium, and we had notified the caretaker. We had messaged in the group WhatsApp to remind everybody that we were leaving, because we needed the road outside, directly outside the entrance to our block, free of cars, so that the removal truck could come. It was 5:30 in the morning. The removal truck was 30 minutes away from the home, and people had still left their cars there. So my poor boyfriend had to go around like knocking on all the doors, telling them at 5:30 in the morning to move the cars. But this is the selfishness of people, right? And so I think sometimes you've got to consider whether this way of living really works for you. But definitely get a feel for your neighbours, shared spaces, what it feels like. Are people respecting those areas? Because this is going to impact the quality of life that you have in that kind of space. I would also be paying attention to the windows when you view your home. And this goes for whether you're viewing an independent home or if you're viewing an apartment, because I link it back to Palermo. Palermo was the most vintage home I think I've ever lived in, but the windows will make or break your apartment, essentially. So where we live now, we have new windows, double glazed, and it retains the heat fantastically in the winter and also helps to keep the apartment fresh in the summer, to the point where we don't even need air conditioning because we've also got stone walls, although we are in the middle of an extreme heat wave at the moment, so we are considering getting the fan out. But that said, in Palermo, the windows were terrible. So I think they were just a single pane of glass. The kind of insulation around the window was gapping in parts. And at points in the winter especially, we would hear the wind whistling through the windows. So it meant in the winter, our apartment was absolutely freezing. And we almost felt like we had to give blankets to our guests. It was pretty embarrassing, I think. And, you know, we had heating, but it was vintage. It didn't work properly. So in the end, we had to buy electric heaters. But essentially we were heating outdoors because, you know, the heat wasn't staying within the apartment. And this is the problem with like the windows, and people don't pay enough attention to these, because this is going to make a huge difference to your bills and to how hot or cold your apartment actually gets. But not only that, pay attention to the shutters. Make sure all of the shutters in your apartment or in your house work, because they are going to be great not only for privacy at night, but also to try to keep your house cool in the summer. If you walk around the streets of Italy in the summer, you might think that everybody has gone on holiday or everybody's out, because people keep their shutters closed, because it's the only way to preserve the freshness inside of the home in those hot months and to keep the beating sun out. And so you want to make sure that you've got some kind of shade outside of your windows, because it's going to become a necessity in the summer in order for you to try to keep your home as cool as possible. So that's another little detail that I have to be honest, we got lucky. We never really had that issue in any of our homes, but I wasn't actively looking for it. And I absolutely would be now, because I know how vital they are. Now, you've also got to be looking out for signs of humidity. Something that a lot of Italian properties suffer from is humidity, which eventually results in issues with mold. Now, I don't remember having this problem in any of the properties I think I've had to date, because the buildings were fairly new and had been renovated. But the property we're in now does have some issues with this. And although it's been treated, we've had to have it retreated recently because the problem came back, because this is the issue. If you have a home that has issues with humidity and mold, that is not going to magically disappear. It's going to be a reoccurring issue. It's very, very difficult, I think, to eradicate this problem from a home. And so as a tenant, you have to be looking out for the signs of it before you sign the lease. Now, it could be argued that we perhaps shouldn't have taken this home because of the humidity, but because it's been treated, we understand it's in a far better condition than other homes that have similar problems. And so we understand that actually it's okay, but you've got to be looking out for this. You've got to be looking out for signs of humidity or anything like that in the crevices, in the cracks on the walls, any kind of water damage within the property. Can you see any parts of the paint that is bulging, indicating that there might be some like water trapped behind the paint? Has any part of the home been freshly painted? This is why you need to come and see this with your eyes, right? Because from a remote call, you're not going to notice this. But sometimes landlords, in order to not deal with the problem, they will just put a fresh lick of paint over the mold. You need to be looking at those areas carefully. Maybe you can pick up on it through the smell, but you need to be looking at that, and also the outside walls. So when we were deciding to move back to Salerno and we were looking at properties, immediately I was turned off by so many because I could see from the outside pictures that the walls were black. And that is a huge, huge, huge red flag, because that indicates that there's a problem with damp. And so pay attention to these signs. Humidity is a real issue here, and especially if you have existing health conditions, or you just want to live in a place that doesn't feel like it's damp all of the time. This is going to be so important, especially because even though landlords should be dealing with this because it is something that they legally have responsibility for, it doesn't mean that every landlord will be as good as ours has been. So really make sure that you pay attention to this from the beginning. And the reason I say this as well is because unless you have a transitory lease, rental contracts here are long term. They're like 3x2, 4x4. And so essentially, if you decide that you've moved here and there is an issue with the home and it's not the place for you, you could have quite a long break clause. Sometimes it could be as long as 6 months if you don't want to lose the money that you've paid towards it. So it's definitely something to pay attention to. I was a bit oblivious to this when I first moved here. Definitely wasn't looking for signs of humidity in the homes. But I think the home that we're in now has really highlighted how important it is that you do. And I would also be comparing prices of the homes that you're interested in, whether they be apartment blocks or independent houses, with other similar properties in the area that you're interested in, because sometimes landlords inflate prices. Now, I think if I'm not mistaken, the 3x2 contract has to be set in line with local market conditions, but the 4x4 contracts, if I'm not mistaken, can actually be independently decided by the landlords. And so you need to be paying attention to the prices that they're asking for, because the reason we didn't move back to Salerno city itself is because the prices of apartments there in the neighborhoods that they were in, which some of which were not great, and like the size of the homes were ridiculous. And I know that the market has changed in the time that we've been away, but I don't think it's to that extent. And so you've just got to be paying attention to this. Do your research, look at other properties, understand dimensions of the houses. Do they correlate to the amount that's been asked for them? This is a really important consideration, because even if the location is great, it's not ideal to be paying top end for something that isn't really worth it. So definitely something to pay attention to. So I hope that this video has given you a little bit of insight into the things that I would do differently if I were renting today for the first time. I think living in Italy, you learn something new every day, and you're not going to get it right first time. You're going to make mistakes, but you're going to learn from those the way that I have. And so if you are really considering renting and this is something that you're interested in, this is the video I think you should watch next, because I share some other things that nobody tells you about when it comes to doing that. I will see you in the next video.